talk, 40 Years Wicca, A Reflection and Glance to the Future by Morgana Sythove. Why this talk? We should have been celebrating our Silver Circle 40th anniversary at Spring Equinox 2020, but as like many other events, it had to be postponed. So too I heard the Scottish Pagan Federation Conference. Ness Bosch approached me, and during our conversation she told me that their conference also had to be cancelled. However, there was a possibility of organising an online event. So this is actually the result. We decided that the celebration of the 40th anniversary could form the basis of a talk about my experiences of being a Wiccan high priestess, a Gardnerian witch, during the last 40 years. But let me first of all introduce myself. And how did it all begin? As a child, I actually wanted to become a priestess. I spent many early years in the north of England, mainly in Lancashire, although I was born in Wales. However, it wasn't until I moved to the Netherlands in 1974 as a young teacher that I became aware of Wicca as a modern-day religion. I left the Netherlands in 1977 for a year or so to continue my search to become a priestess, and travelled overland to India. During my travels, I learned a great deal about different cultures and spirituality, but the main realisation was that my future lay in the West. So I returned back to the Netherlands and back to join Merlin, who I'd actually met in about 1976. Together we started our search for Wicca in earnest. 1979, however, was the year when things changed dramatically. We had done quite a lot of the natural magic course, which was organised by Marion Green. And in fact, Marion Green was one of the first people we connected with as far as our search for Wicca. However, in that same year, I lost my job as a teacher. I lost my room because my landlord wanted to move, and Merlin also had to move to a new house. So what do we do? Of course, we filled the car with as much as we could, and off we went to England for a holiday. And what a magical journey it turned out to be. It started with a visit to the Atlantis bookshop in London. Merlin found a newsletter with a call for new members in a coven in Brighton. No email address, of course, not even a phone number, just an address. In those days, one would write letters and wait for a reply, but we really didn't have time for that. We had to go back to the Netherlands. So after visiting Avebury and Glastonbury, Tintagel and the New Forest, we decided to call in at this address in Brighton. There one late afternoon, I knocked on the door of an old Victorian house. The door opened, and a man, the spitting image of Gerald Garner, stood before us. But he just took one look at us and closed the door. So of course I thought, oh well, that's it. But a minute later, he opened the door again, and he just said, I have to pick up my wife, would you like to come? And 2 seconds later, there we were in the car with a complete stranger heading for the centre of Brighton. We picked up a lady in her late 30s, early 40s, and she looked at us and she said, aha, I guess you'll be staying for dinner. Later, she told us that they had been expecting us. So this was very curious. But we joined them for dinner and talked and talked. Who were we? What were we looking for? Who were they? We met them once more before leaving back to the Netherlands. Back to no job, no home. However, it didn't take too much time before we found a room, albeit way too expensive for a student and an unemployed teacher. 3 weeks later, there was a telephone call, and of course, at first I thought, oh my goodness, this is This is, if it's an international phone call in those days, it would probably be something, something about life and death. So I was really curious. But suddenly I heard on the other end of the line, hello, we've been thinking about you and Dennis. Would you like to be initiated? Wow. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. But of course we said yes. And at autumn equinox 1979, we went back to Brighton and were initiated first degree Gardnerians. As we started to practice the tradition in the Netherlands, we quickly realised that the flow of forces and spirits of the land in this country were different from those in Britain. We listened to the feel of the land, experimented with the flow of power, and working on integrating some of the local folk customs into our Wicca practice. One of the first things we did was to create the Silver Circle network with the quarterly magazine Wiccan Raid as our newsletter. It was officially launched at Spring Equinox 1980. It was described as being a Dutch-English magazine with articles on Wicca and witchcraft. Wiccan Raid Online is the successor of the paper magazine Wiccan Raid that appeared from spring 1980 until and including Lammas 2010. Wiccan Raid has its roots in Gardner Wicca, of course, but has always presented views from other traditions, both Wiccan and Pagan. We also pointed out that Wicca, or modern witchcraft, as an initiatory path, is open to those who want to become a priestess or priest and to follow the path of initiation and training within a regular coven. Gerald Gardner was the first to document this tradition and the word Wicca as a modern-day religion. Wicca is on the one hand a nature religion, revering a goddess and god, celebrating 8 seasonal festivals and 13 full moons, at least every 3 years we have a 13th moon, and working magic. Many people nowadays use the word Wicca to describe solely the religion. The words witchcraft and solitary witchcraft are used as well by the ones that want to connect individually with the goddess and the god without following the initiatory path. We, of course, weren't the only ones to be publishing newsletters in the 1980s. In fact, many of our Wiccan and Pagan contacts were made when we corresponded with other editors and exchanged magazines. The majority of contacts were from the English-speaking world, United Kingdom, USA, Canada and Australia. The introduction of internet and use of email in the mid-1990s issued a death toll for many of those newsletters. The emergence of goddess spirituality, especially from America, however, thrived on the World Wide Web and made a huge impact in Europe and on the Neo-Pagan movement. Later, when I started looking at the development of Neo-Paganism in Europe since the 1860s when the term was coined, I started to realize that if we saw it as a cultural phenomenon, it became easier to pinpoint differences and commonalities. However, even more so than in the United States, the cultural differences between European countries and the shift of political boundaries in the last 150 years made it more difficult to generalize. As a practitioner, though, I have seen in the last 40 years that there has been a gradual emergence of what we could call Western-style paganism, with a great emphasis on goddess spirituality and the reverence for nature, and that Eastern European-style paganism has a much greater emphasis on male leadership and heroism. However, as people intermingle and share rituals, there is a shift in emphasis. A term used with respect to the Western European-style paganism is Wiccanish, Wiccanesque, alluding to the early works of Gerald Gardner and others, and the influence Wicca ritual practice and philosophy has had on the neo-pagan movement. Even though a group today may call themselves, for example, heathen, many of the practices are recognizably Wiccan, including a duo polytheistic godhead, the drawing of a magical circle, calling the 4 quarters, following the wheel of the year, and celebrating 8 seasonal festivals. I always think this is perhaps the biggest compliment that Gerald Gardner could have ever wished for. That his interest in folklore, connection with the goddess, interest in naturism and many other things, leading to the creation of Wicca, has evolved in itself into a cultural phenomenon and not just a religion. Undoubtedly, the emergence of internet and social media has encouraged and influenced many people to look at their own cultural roots. So how do I think Wicca is going to change? It's one of the things that I keep wondering about. As I said, I've been involved in Wicca for 40 years, and I'm thinking sometimes about how it's survived and grown and where we're actually going. Also, I was thinking about these ideas when I started. Of course, in my experience, it will continue to develop in a natural way. Certainly because I think Wicca at the heart is an organic way, an organic religion that is deeply based in natural evolution. I remember at one point when there were all these people and groups mushrooming up, and at that point I felt kind of responsible for them, but lots of people running around saying they were claiming to be this and that, and I was thinking that I had to correct them all the time. But then I thought, well, this is really not useful or productive, because things will evolve how they're meant to evolve anyway. So you might have an idea, but often things don't turn out quite as you expect them. One of the things I've been thinking about recently is as well about the expectations of people who are searching for the craft right now and what we can offer them, and that is perhaps an indication of how we're going to evolve. So in other words, keeping in touch with the reality and actually what's happening around you. One of the things, first of all, the thing that really changed is the amount of information that's available. When I was looking for the craft, there was very little information. This change is connected to how people communicate today. There's social media, so now people can go through the training living in different parts of the world thanks to email and other forms of social media. Also, I think how we're going to practice our craft will change according to where we actually live. I try to do the rituals outside as much as possible and try to connect to the spirits of the land. Even in small groups, we have people from all over Europe using different languages. Recently, at my own celebration of 40 years of Wiccan practice, there were people from many different countries speaking a variety of different languages. I realized how much it has changed. We are becoming much more mobile, pardon the pun, using the internet, even if we don't travel physically. But then I thought maybe, in fact, nothing has actually changed that much, because we've always communicated on what we could call an astral level in a very intuitive way. So in the physical world, things are changing and developing actually more and more as to how we communicate in a very astral way. How is this going to change? I think we're going to become much more aware about how to develop this virtual communication. This is a development in consciousness that many young people are aware of. So perhaps in the next 30 years we'll see much more of a connection in this sense. The one thing about the COVID-19 outbreak was the immediate change to online meetings. No doubt, if and when the lockdowns are over, this way of communicating will continue, and that even practices between covens will be much more regularly communicated by online meetings, etc. Someone asked me recently how I actually continue practicing in an international coven when we don't really meet that often physically. I actually replied in the first instance that it's never really been a concern of ours. We've always managed to work on an astral level, and well, I've been doing it for 40 years, so nothing in that sense has changed. But of course there will always be those moments when physical contact will be preferable, like initiations, but who knows how things will continue in the future. The other thing is also about the level of acceptance, and I think in the future that various ways of working will become more acceptable as much as the connections we have with people as unique beings. There's obviously this thing about whether it matters if someone is male or female because of the change in perception of gender. Gender fluidity. I think it's the next big change, that there is going to be a greater acceptance of people being individual. And yet we can also have this collective experience. I think there is another huge change that people started to realise, although that we can't define our covens by male or female, that we in fact have to start thinking in terms of people as people. I've always said that we stand as witches in circle. I realised when I was looking back at 40 years that one of the things I'd never really had a problem with was the fact that people can identify as neither male or female. I've always realised that it's all right. I see people as being unique, and I think that's going to have a greater acceptance in the future as well. Some people in the craft are going to stick to the tradition and will keep to a very heterosexual attitude. But I think that that particular way of working is going to fade out, at least in the sense that it's not going to be the norm. I think the norm is going to be a much wider acceptance of people as human beings and being part of human nature. I think we've only really started understanding what we can do from a conscious point of view and our abilities and potential as human beings. So I think that the sooner we accept that everybody has a huge potential, whether they're male or female, you come also to the idea of people who are less able or differently abled. Anyway, what is less abled? Some people could be seen as such in comparison to fully abled, but they can have other talents, like having an inner eye. We'll be realizing that people have different abilities, and we will have also a greater understanding of how people can work magically and heal and understand in a different way. We will experience a human being in all its potential, so I think that is a big change as well. When thinking about the tradition, well, first of all, tradition is not set in stone. It can also evolve. What does tradition actually mean? I understand it means something which is rooted, has roots. It has a definite root in a specific culture, for example. So I think that what we're actually looking at is how the tradition itself is going to change naturally. Tradition is also something that connects us to the family, to the land. For me, Wicca is organic. It changes naturally because anything which is organic will evolve by its very nature. The more the tradition evolves, the greater chance is that it will survive. It should be used as a reference. We can use it as a point of learning to know how our ancestors worked, how they thought, and learn from that. But we must also look at it critically, otherwise we'll do it a disservice. Personally, I celebrate the fact that tradition evolves, and yet it reflects our ancestors' hopes, our hopes. In a way, one of the things I'd like to do in the craft is to fulfill my ancestors' dreams, to follow their steps and to heed the messages that they had from the gods. You can argue that some of the things from the past were not necessarily something to strive for, but as I said, we can be critical, and we should look at what our ancestors did and why they did these things. With regard to homosexuality and the topic of gender expression, with regard to the question about homophobia and the notion that Gerald Gardner was homophobic, I would like to point out that the culture and the time he was living in did not accept homosexuality. In fact, during his lifetime it was illegal. His views reflected the attitudes in the society of the day. But I wonder whether if Gerald lived today, he would be homophobic. I don't think so. Gerald was a naturist. I remember asking Eleanor Bone about being naked in the rituals. She pointed out that Gerald could have been arrested as a pervert at the time if he had been caught holding rituals where people were naked. I also remember Doreen Valiente at one of the Pagan Federation conferences in the 90s, hinting that she was very pro-gay. And taking into consideration that in Gerald's time they could have been arrested for participating in naked rituals, we can assume that things definitely would have changed for these older Wiccans who at the time were openly gay, openly anti-gay. As I said, Doreen was incredibly open about homosexuality and outspoken in her views. Also, I would never call Gerald a saint, but he was like a visionary, and surely Doreen was also a visionary. The only person that I know who was very homophobic was Lois Bourne. She wrote in one of her books that Gardner was homophobic, and she agreed with him. So what about gender? Coming back to the gender issue, in the 1990s, I remember people were making a huge thing of polarity. Nearly everything was polarized to male and female. I think really people got the law of polarity mixed up with the law of gender. The law of gender has everything to do with genetics of becoming, whilst the law of polarity has to do with things that are seemingly opposite. There is a creative dynamism between two absolutes, two poles of hot and cold, up and down. Do we actually have a male-female polarity? Well, males and females as human beings all have certain aspects within them that represent a polarity, are concerned with a polarity. But I think that what has happened was that people didn't really have an understanding that we were talking about males or females, and that we were actually talking about the genetic side of people. So when we talk about polarity, we talk about dynamic forces. Of course, in a circle of male and females, we can talk about creating a tension because of all the sexual energy that's around. But again, I don't think we should mix that up. To me, we work with erotic rather than sexual energy. Erotic energy that we work with in a circle is immensely powerful. I think that when it comes to gender, people should be more aware about how energies are being called up or invoked or evoked. From a genetic point of view, everyone in the circle is unique. If I see a man standing before me in a circle, I don't necessarily see him as having male energy only. Body parts do not automatically create a specific set of rules and regulations. In the end, we talk about individuals. Some people will identify more with male or female aspects, and it can change from ritual to ritual. Sometimes I can feel extremely male, even as far as being stereotypical. I can get quite aggressive or assertive, but then again, is aggression a male quality? It is something we should all be careful about. I think in this case it has a lot more to do with, for example, astrology and the way that astrology has also approached these personality traits. It also definitely has a role in understanding how people work. I am, for example, an Aries, and I have a lot of Martian energy, which may account for my assertive behavior. So while doing magic, we have to understand the mindset of a specific person we do the magic for. And in the circle, we have to understand also people's backgrounds. I think the most important thing is that gender fluidity is something which we all need to be aware of. But also we must remember about other things such as someone's biography, whether they have had a history of abuse and so on. All these things count. Sometimes we must do it on a very intuitive level. We have to use our own intuition to do successful magical work, also if it comes to polarity and gender. We have some stereotypes because it helps to get a bigger picture, but ultimately we have to make our own decisions about how we actually act. And in this sense, we're coming to the ethical side of things. We cannot use the argument of it's a tradition without really thinking about what we're doing. And we should remember that the Wiccan raid and it harm none, do what you will, was actually an instruction for magical work and helps us to understand how our actions will have an effect and taking personal responsibility. So what is the future of Wicca? and spirituality in the modern world. I think Wicca has a place as a religion, as a mystery tradition. It wouldn't, though, I think, if people are going to try to make it a doctrine or more dogmatic. I think that form of Wicca will probably not have a future. In my opinion, if more and more people realise that religion, the word itself, means to link people with something greater, then Wicca definitely will have a place. If we prepare to link with other people and to be open to other ways, to other people, and to reach out to other cultures and not be afraid of them. I think we have a lot to offer, certainly, if it comes to our connection with the earth, with nature, with the starry heavens, and of course with the cosmos. But I'd say that one of the biggest things we have to offer is that we have this direct communication with the gods, which is also found with Indigenous people. I think in that sense we have a lot to offer young people, because we don't necessarily have to have a system. We don't necessarily have to be initiated into a specific tradition like Wicca. We can still have the Wiccan idea of, for example, connecting with the sacred feminine, the goddess side, but it's particularly important, and that is particularly important. So I don't think that side of things will fade away. I think more and more people begin to connect to this idea of the earth as a living entity. I mean, it's kind of bizarre that people haven't held on to that the earth is a living identity. This is exactly what I think is sometimes the church and Christianity and the other religions have lost. This sense of the earth as being a living identity, and the respect for Mother Earth, and the devotion of the early mystics, and that the early mystics had. But again, many of the Indigenous people have continued that practice. So I think people involved in Wicca should be more and more prepared to be open to ideas from Indigenous people and react to their ways and how they react. I think more and more people begin to connect to this idea of the earth as a living entity. I mean, it's kind of bizarre that people haven't held on to that the earth is a living entity. This is exactly what I think sometimes the church and Christianity and the other religions lost. This sense of the earth as being a living entity, and the respect for Mother Earth, and the devotion of the early mystics had. But again, many of the Indigenous people have continued that practice, so I think people involved in Wicca should be more and more prepared to be open to ideas from Indigenous people and react to their ways, of course, in a sense that we can join in without misappropriating their cultures. Thus we'll have more and more respect for the land, more respect for other people's cultures. I think religion also has a very cultural aspect. The more we become accepting of different views, the more likely we will be able to continue and preserve Wicca. But it's only if people are willing to be a little bit more organic about things. It seems that people are looking much more for a natural approach, however you define natural. And even more people are looking for a one-to-one communication and connection. So even atheists are doing this because they want also to have their own one-to-one experience. They don't want rules by the Pope or anybody else. I can get on with an atheist because I can also appreciate scientific progression, and we have common ground to appreciate certain things like art or the creative process. Religion can help us to be linked, but it requires much more openness and acceptance that we are all part of the earth. We are all responsible for it. It depends on how willing we are to alter our consciousness and to be really very flexible. I think that we should, like the Indigenous people, try to understand the essence of being and understanding the nature of sacred in Wicca and our connections to it. The important thing is that we try to connect to this life force, that we have this sense of wonder and engage in a mystical experience. I think it's the idea which children have naturally, and it's this kind of continuance of this wonderment. Whether you express that in connection with a god or goddess or nature spirit, it is connecting with the divine. But it's perhaps more than that. It's actually also following the footprint of the gods and the flow of the rivers. When somebody comes to me, for example, and wants to find out more about our guidance course, then one of the first things I'll ask them is, who are you? Where are you coming from? Who are your ancestors? What's your connection with the land, the connection to your own town, for example? It is mainly to let people realise that perhaps as a child they had a secret place where they felt at one with their surroundings, or a favourite tree, or a particular stone, or connections with an animal, and so on. It doesn't necessarily have to be a place in nature. It can also be a book or an object like a stone. Then they actually realise that what they're doing is basically what we're actually they then realise what they're doing is in fact reconnecting, and then in some cases realise that they have never lost this connection. Sometimes that something that people are inspired by, and whether it's the myths that they loved or the fairy tales that their parents would read to them or tell them, it's the stories, it's this connection that inspires you, it lifts you. Connecting to this mystical experience is so important now. Our roots and background are particularly important or not. As I said earlier, many of us have had pantheons which we feel connected to. It again tells us something about our own past, about our own ancestors. So I think this is why it's vitally important that people continue that, even if you travel. So connecting to your own culture and finding out more about your own ancestors. For example, when talking to people who've moved, say, to Australia, they will say, from England, for example, they will say they still feel very much connected to the English countryside. Or if they're Irish and they've moved to America, that they still feel very connected to Ireland. All these things are things which make up our personality and are very important. I have an English background, and so it's important for me to really connect with my own Englishness, with the spirits of the land, of my own ancestors, because that's what connects you to this ancient memory. People may come across a few things which they're not particularly proud of, you know. I mean, I, as somebody who was born in England or Wales, having a British background, I can say British have had a lot of black pages in their history, the colonial past and all the rest. But even that is very important to recognise and also to acknowledge. Educators always have said that the first 7 years of a baby's life are the most important. So wherever you were in those first 7 years, that would be significant for the rest of your life. You cannot ever erase it. And how many people try to forget? I will try to put it out. It always leads to problems. In the Netherlands, we have people who are from Suriname. They have Hindu backgrounds, coming from originally from India or Indonesia. And even though they have lived in Europe or even being born here, they still have the feeling that there is something not quite right. So if their grandparents don't want to talk about what's happened to them, then it starts to be a big problem. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge and familiarise ourselves with our own backgrounds and recognise that sometimes the things that actually draw us are very much to do with our backgrounds, almost as if our ancestors are calling us. And in fact, this is exactly what many people feel when they come to Wicca. They feel as if they're coming home. And I think this sense of coming home is down to a recognition of who we are as a soul, as a sentient being. This helps us also to understand other people. And when we're doing magical work, we can also relate to those fears and those blockages which have actually resulted in people feeling at dis-ease, the English word dis-ease. So I think in magical work, when we consider all these aspects, that we are able to be much more open, and I think this is the heart of Wicca, to be open to other people and to go a little bit further than what they're actually trying to in a sense try to associate with and deny their actual backgrounds. It's again very natural for us to want to be something that we aren't, but in the end I think it's good for people to realize that sooner or later you will be able to become who you are meant to be and to follow the red thread in your own life, but on your own terms. And I think this is really, really important, that people are able to feel comfortable. And again, once they have reconciled their own past, and reconciled the fact that they too have been perhaps wounded, that they also can move towards being healed. And I'm not saying that Wicca is the only way that people can heal, but I do think it has the potential to give people the skills and the tools to be able to become what they are meant to become. Thank you for listening.